All right, team. Today we are reading The Red-Tailed Angels. Chapter 1, Tuskegee Army Airfield, Tuskegee, Alabama, April 1943. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the only sound coming from the barracks was the slow, measured breathing of men deep in sleep. Only one was awake. Charlie held a flashlight over the book on his lap, but his gaze was set on the photograph tucked into the crease between the pages. From the picture, a handsome man in a suit and tie stared back at him, a mischievous look in his eyes. This was his pop. Now, gray and retired, his father had sent him off to Tuskegee 2 years ago with a stern direction. Now you show those men what it means to be a fighter. This is no small thing. The Army finally having us fly planes. Do me proud. But most of all, you come back alive. You understand? Charlie felt the weight of many people on his shoulders, but he had merely nodded and given Pop a quick hug. He ran to the bus waiting for him and refused to look back. He hadn't wanted his father to see the fear on his face, the fear that was coursing through his whole body. Now, as he sat in the dark of the barracks, Charlie felt that same overwhelming dread. Tomorrow morning, the squadron was shipping out, and despite months of training filled with countless practice missions, Charlie wondered if he was really ready. A man heading into war was like a blind man walking along the edge of a cliff. Would he sense and successfully respond to the dangers around him, or would one misstep lead him to death? After he fell asleep, Charlie dreamt of his home back in Philly, his head filled with the images of his old room at Penn and warm afternoons spent studying on the university lawn. A dedicated student and avid reader, Charlie was rarely seen without a book in his hands. And while this may have helped him graduate with honors and ace all of his written exams at the civilian pilot school, now it was also the cause of a lot of teasing by the other men in the barracks. On his first night on base, a hefty shadow had loomed over him as he sat reading on his cot. "Hey, Ace," came a thick drawl from above him. "That book tell you how you're going to kill some Nazis? Because really, that's all we need to know. All the other words there are just wasting your time." As a matter of fact, this book, Charlie had started to explain before the large man cut him off. Yeah, why don't you put that book down and come play some cards? He reached out his enormous hand to Charlie. "The name's Antoine Douglas, but people call me Tex." Charlie had just assumed that Antoine was from Texas. He learned later that Tex actually hailed from Louisiana and earned his name due to his size. "Big as the state of Texas," Antoine had said with a deep bellowing laugh when he explained his nickname to Charlie. People often cowered in Tex's presence, and he used this to his advantage. But thankfully for Charlie, Tex had taken a liking to him. He also introduced him to two other men who had become his closest friends, McCleary, and Smith, whom everyone called Mac and Smitty. Now, at 0600 sharp, the four men stood at attention with the rest of their squadron, awaiting orders. Their tightly packed bags lined the floor behind their feet. Suddenly, Colonel Lewis barged through the front door of the barracks and walked along the line of men, inspecting their appearance. "All right, men," he barked, "here's what's going to happen. In 2 hours, we'll get on the train to New York, and from there, we'll board the Mariposa. Destination, Africa. Our intelligence tells us that the Germans have some AA emplacements on an island a short flight away that could put our bombers in danger. We need to take them out. It's time to quit playing pretend and get into this thing. I think you all know the significance of this mission goes beyond our primary objective. You will be the first all-black air unit going into active combat. Let's show the world how ready we are." Just as abruptly as he had entered, the colonel turned and left. The men relaxed their stance and broke from the line. "Ah, good old New York, my hometown," Smitty started to sing, adding lyrics as he went. "Too bad we won't have time to see the city. I could show you all my old hangouts." "You mean like your parents' basement?" asked Tex. "Very funny, big man. No, I'm talking about some high-class establishments, good food, and even better music. Things a roughneck like you wouldn't know anything about." To distract Tex from the insult, Matt quickly changed the subject. "What I want to know is why they are sending us to Africa. It's darn hot there. Y'all can barely handle this Alabama heat. What do you think that Africa heat will do to you? Smitty, you'll be a sweaty mess." Charlie and Smitty laughed, but then gave each other a serious look, knowing he was right. Mac was used to the sticky southern weather from his days growing up on a farm in Georgia, but the long, hot days of Alabama summers had been torture for the rest of them. Charlie couldn't help but wonder if the African heat might do them all in before the enemy even had the chance. The enemy, thought Charlie. Here in Alabama, the enemy seemed like a mythical creature. But once they were in Africa, everything that they had been training for would become a reality. Chapter 2, North Africa, May 1943. The base was different from what the men had become accustomed to back in Alabama, but nothing less than what one would expect from a war encampment. Rows of canvas tents served as sleeping quarters, and a makeshift kitchen was set up in one of the larger tents. But training took up so much of their time that they scarcely noticed the discomfort of their new surroundings. A different officer, Major Conrad, was assigned to prepare them for combat, and he drilled them each day until they were bleary-eyed. Major Conrad's temper was infamous, and he had been storming around the base all day, screaming out instructions to the pilots. No one was exempt from his berating. As Charlie was checking over his plane's machinery one day, he witnessed Major Conrad storming into the officer's tent. He knew he probably shouldn't eavesdrop, but he found himself edging closer and closer to the tent's opening. "What is it going to take for you men to be ready for war, Colonel?" the major hollered, dramatically throwing his cap on the ground. "Am I going to have to go up there with them and hold their hands?" Colonel Lewis maintained his characteristic calm demeanor. "With all due respect, Major," he said, emphasizing the man's rank, which was lower than his own. "These men are some of the best pilots out there, and you know that as well as I do. How many men have you seen who can dive bomb like they can? Please tell me, because I'd like to see them for myself." "Well, I know you think these men are special, sir, but the rest of us have yet to see it. They can fly fancy pants maneuvers all they want, but that won't mean anything when they come face to face with enemy planes that are locked and loaded and ready to shoot at them right out of the clear blue sky." The major grabbed his cap and hastily placed it on his head, and as he started towards the tent's entrance. "I'll give it to you that these men are good pilots, but it's my job to make sure they're good combat pilots." After he was sure the major was out of earshot, Charlie approached the tent and cleared his throat. "Colonel, you think the major treats everyone he trains the same way he treats us?" "He definitely has made a name for himself, hasn't he?" Colonel Lewis laughed. "And that's just how some men are, especially in the Army. So maybe it doesn't matter to him that we're the first Black Squadron, but I'm sure it doesn't help matters any." Charlie nodded and the colonel continued. "But listen, if we spend our time dwelling on all of our doubts people have about us, there'd be no time left to fight this war. Now let's let our flying speak for itself." Weeks later, when Charlie was beginning to wonder if they would ever get the chance to prove themselves, the squadron was called up for its first combat mission. "Welcome to war, my brothers," Tex's voice boomed out over the squadron's radio system as they patrolled the skies over the Mediterranean and approached an island. Charlie's heart hammered inside his chest as he maneuvered his P-40 plane past Smitty's and dove toward the island that was now in clear sight. He could see the barrels of anti-aircraft weapons pointed up in his direction from dozens of emplacements. As they started firing at him, he released a single 500-pound bomb from the belly of the plane. He saw the people on the ground scramble for cover. It was the first time Charlie had engaged his P-40's weaponry outside of training. He wasn't firing at practice targets anymore. Throughout the next week, the squadron continued to run missions against the island. Day after day, the flyers escorted the fighter groups and launched attacks against the enemy's gun positions. "Man, at this point," Mac's voice cracked through on the radio, "I could run this route in my sleep." "Me too," Smitty said. "Heck, I was just asleep," Tex chimed in. "But now that I'm awake, why don't I liven things up a bit?" "I'm afraid to know what that means," Charlie said into his radio, just as he saw Tex dive past him and flip his plane into a barrel roll. Tex was known for his daredevil antics. Even though Charlie couldn't deny that Tex had some impressive tricks, he thought he knew better than to perform them in the middle of a mission. "Tex, what are you doing? Now's not the time to show off," Charlie called on the radio. "Oh, lighten up. Why can't I have a little fun?" Charlie didn't have an answer for him. Sure, doing unnecessary barrel rolls on a mission could be dangerous and earn Tex some scolding from the higher-ups, but this patrol was pretty straightforward, and both the major and colonel were back at base. Plus, no one was a better pilot than Tex. Charlie began to consider that maybe he was too uptight sometimes. When the other guys fooled around and poked fun at each other, He was usually the one to set them straight, or at least he tried to. The mood of this mission was fairly relaxed, though, so how could some fun hurt? Just as he decided to loosen up and give Tex a break, he heard the loud roar break through the clouds ahead of them. Is is that what I think it is? Asked Mac. Are those Germans? Smitty cried. Charlie held his breath as he watched Tex's plane tumbling right in front of an approaching ME 109. In all the times they had flown this same route over the past several days, not once had they encountered any enemy aircraft. But now here they were, 4 ME 109s heading straight toward them. Charlie felt like he might pass out, but remembering his training, he gathered his focus and tightened his grip on the controls. Quickly, he veered to the right, pushed the throttle, and fired at the Germans. As his plane launched forward, he glanced down to see Tex right his plane and join in the attack. The ME 109s weaved in and out, dodging their fire. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they shot up and flew out of range. When the squadron landed back at base, the men exited their planes and walked back to their tent. Nice work up there, my friends, Tex said to the other 3, shaking hands with each one. You're just lucky you didn't get yourself killed with that little show you put on for us, Smitty said. Yeah, I was in total control the whole time. Nothing to worry about, Tex explained. Tex replied with an air of cockiness. But despite his words, the men all saw a look of fear dart across his face. Even the great Tex Douglas wasn't immortal, and perhaps he was finally starting to learn that. The next day, the squadron raided the island again, but this time Tex maintained his focus and made sure to keep his plane upright. And though this mission was no different from the rest, the day became a historic one as the enemy forces on the island surrendered in defeat.